all have aggressive policies to support R&D, to support skill development, to reduce taxes, and increasingly to steal intellectual property, to force U.S. manufacturers to move overseas and move that IP overseas. So market forces alone are not going to solve the problem, in part also because a lot of these challenges are when a manufacturer invests in new capital equipment, or when they invest in R&D, or when they invest in training their workers, they only actually get about half of those benefits. The other half of those benefits essentially spill over, what economists call spillovers. The other half of those benefits go to their competitors and go to their suppliers and go to consumers overall. And so left to themselves, profit maximizing rational companies will underinvest in these key building blocks. And that's why we have the R&D tax credit. But it's also why we need the specific policies like this. And lastly, as I mentioned, key competitors are already taking action. They have national competitiveness and manufacturing policies which have proved quite successful. So the next question is, well, we need a manufacturing policy. Why do we need an NNMI? I'm going to turn that over to my colleague David.
Thanks, Rob. So, we're on the right slide. So the argument of the paper is that innovation should be at the center of this national manufacturing policy. It's not enough by itself, and ITIF has many other reports on other aspects of manufacturing policy, whether it's trade, taxation, regulation. So the argument here is not that innovation is a panacea, but it's a necessary part of any response to the competitive challenge that American manufacturing faces. And the reasons are multiple. Let me just sketch a couple here, and you can read the details in the paper. There's plenty of labor-intensive, low-skill, old-style manufacturing out there in the world, and American workers shouldn't be in competition for that. We want jobs that are high-skill, that pay well, that produce a lot of value for our economy for lots of reasons. And there should be international trade in manufacturing products. And we should be at the high end of that trading process. Second reason is that this is what Americans are good at. We have plenty of institutions that know how to innovate, companies, universities, government laboratories. We have a lot of resources to put into this effort. And the challenge is to draw them together. So as Rob mentioned, innovation in manufacturing in particular doesn't pay off entirely for the company, although there are things that companies should do and should invest in, and I'm sure we'll hear from our colleagues about that. But there are other things where all the parties need to get together, where academia doesn't provide quite the right incentives, where the market doesn't provide quite the right incentives, and where if government acts alone, it will simply waste its money. So NNMI is meant to be an approach that brings together all these partners and produces something of real value for the manufacturing sector. So what is it? I stole a diagram from the AMP report, the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership report that the White House put out this summer. I think the best metaphor for any part of the network is a hub. So we're calling the nodes of this network institutes for manufacturing innovation. And that's the green blob in the middle here. And they are freestanding enterprises that are connected up with small manufacturers, large manufacturers, research institutions, which might be universities, it might be government laboratories, as well as community colleges, organizations that do training of skilled workers, and other kinds of entities as well. So then this next one is my own graphic, so I tried to use my limited graphical skills where I just shrunk those hubs down and put them all around the country and link them up. So we have regionally based or industry-based hubs that connect up with all the key parties in the manufacturing sector or a manufacturing region, which may serve a number of industries that are linked together by a common process, for instance. And then they're all connected up across the country here. So all I did was shrink that previous slide down and stick it on the map. So that's the extent of my PowerPoint skills. So now you've seen it all. If you're one of my students, this is the peak of my performance. Okay, so we've laid out a set of principles in the document that we think should guide the design. I saw Mike Molnar come in. Mike is the head of the Advanced Manufacturing National Program Office for the country, and he's been running a series of workshops as well as a request for information process that is meant to elicit design ideas from lots of stakeholders all around the country. And I know ITIF responded, and many of you may have as well. So this is our take on that, our distillation of our views, but the key thing here is to start a conversation. We need to have first a conversation about this, then we need to move to action on it. So that's what we're really trying to jumpstart with this paper. So 5 principles for the design, and I'll just run through them individually. So the first one, these institutes for manufacturing innovation should focus on significant industry-defined innovation challenges. So industry-defined is probably the most important term here. It's industry that ultimately has to use the products of these centers, adopt them into their businesses, and do it quickly because the competition is not waiting, as Rob mentioned. So it's important for industry to generate the ideas that drive these institutes. They need to be focused. They're building a set of resources that can be drawn upon for innovation by a sector, by a region, by a group of sectors that are joined together by a common set of challenges. So there has to be a focus. So for instance, the Pilot Institute that has been funded in Youngstown is focused on additive manufacturing. There's a list in the document of lots of ideas that came forth in the request for information process about what focus areas there might be. And then it has to be big enough to make a difference. So the concept of critical mass, I think, is useful in thinking about this. It has to be able to drive the sector forward.
There's seats all over here if you want to, folks over by the door, if you want to come in. There's stuff here as well.
Great, thanks, Rob. So we'll come back to the money in a minute. We have a kind of ballpark idea, roughly 10 times the size of a big university research center, and comparable in scale to the Fraunhofer Institutes, which some of you may know about in Germany, would perform this function. There are 60 of these across Germany, so it's a €2.5 billion operation, I think. So that gives us some sense of scale. Okay, so focus on significant industry-defined innovation challenges. That was the question of what is innovation, and I think this is probably the most important principle that I would stress, which is that innovation is not just about research. We have a sort of historical division of labor in this country. The public sector supports research, and the private sector does development. And that alone is not an innovation process. Innovation is about making a difference in practice. It does involve those elements, but it may also involve a number of other activities that are listed here, whether it's getting the industry together to think about where it's going, technology road mapping, whether it's defining standards, whether it's training workers. All these things are critical to making an innovation that really works in practice. And so we envision these institutes as being hubs for all these activities, not just carrying out research like a university. We don't want to recreate the university system here. And we don't want to be competing with industry either. So it needs to have a distinctive space and providing support for innovation activities that serve business but really make a difference in practice. And then the last point here, initial deployment to domestic facilities. I think this is something where we need a little bit more thought. We have some initial ideas. These institutes need to benefit American production facilities, but there's no way that you can, in this world, keep all the knowledge in the United States. So I think we have to imagine this as giving the U.S. lead time and eventually expecting that these ideas will spread internationally. But obviously, if we're dealing with, especially with small and medium enterprises, you know, those enterprises are going to take these up right here, right now, and in America. Third principle, we think these institutes should be freestanding. They are going to involve a lot of partners, and so if the previous principle was the most important one, this one might be the hardest one to actually carry out. How do you actually operate an entity that serves a number of different parties, not just big companies, but also small companies that are going to be funded by federal government and state agencies? that are going to involve research universities and community colleges. So there's a lot of players here, and I think the only way that they succeed is if they have their own identity.